Florence, February 1513. A man is being tortured. He is not a common criminal. He is the former secretary of the Florentine Republic, the man who, for 14 years, managed the diplomacy, the military and the administration of one of the most sophisticated states in Europe. The man who had personally negotiated with the Pope, with the King of France, and with Cesare Borgia. The charge is conspiracy against the Medici. The evidence is a list. His name appears on a piece of paper found with one of the conspirators. There is no proof that he knew anything at all. The interrogator applies the strappado, arms tied behind the back, the body suspended by the wrists, then dropped with a jolt that stops just short of the ground. Again and again, the man does not confess, because there was nothing to confess. When they release him weeks later, as the result of a general amnesty, he goes to his farmhouse on the outskirts of Florence and begins to write. The book he writes that year changed forever the way the world thinks about power. It was called The Prince. The man was called Niccolò Machiavelli. What you are about to hear is not the story of the evil man who taught tyrants how to oppress. That version is convenient, and it is false. It is the story of a man who spent 14 years observing power from the inside, not as theory, not as distant philosophy, but as daily practice. He watched alliances form in the morning and be betrayed by nightfall. He saw promises made only to be broken once they were no longer useful. And he possessed something rare: the courage to write down exactly what he saw, without trying to make power look more noble than it truly is. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here I explore the ideas, the people, and the moments in history that continue to shape the way the world works today. Because what Niccolò Machiavelli understood about power more than 500 years ago remains uncomfortably relevant. And perhaps the most curious detail is this: many of those who criticize him in public often behave exactly as he described. There is an adjective in practically every European language that derives directly from the name of one man, Machiavellian, used to describe someone who uses manipulation, deception, and calculated cruelty as instruments of power. Someone without moral scruples. Someone who treats others as pieces in a game that only he fully understands. It is one of the greatest misunderstandings in the history of Western intellectual thought. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. The son of a middle-class jurist who gave him access to a solid classical education, but not to the wealth or the connections that opened the doors of Florentine power. He spent the first 29 years of his life in almost complete obscurity. There are no significant records from this period, which suggests he was not a prominent figure in any of the circles that mattered. In 1498, everything changed. Savonarola was burned in the Piazza della Signoria, the Florentine Republic that the Dominican friar had dominated for 4 years with a religious intensity that the Florentines had initially embraced and progressively come to despise, needed to rebuild its administrative machinery. Machiavelli, at 29 years old and with no compromising history with any faction, was appointed second chancellor of the Republic. It was a managerial position, not one of power, the modern equivalent of a senior secretary of state, but it gave direct access to the decisions that shaped the destiny of Florence and, through diplomacy, to the decisions that shaped the destiny of all of Italy. Machiavelli used that access for 14 years with an attentiveness that went far beyond what the position required. He observed, he recorded, he analyzed. Not merely what rulers did, but why certain actions worked and others did not. What distinguished the prince who survived from one who was deposed? How fear and love and respect operated in the relationships between those who held power and those who were subject to it. In 1512, the Medici returned to Florence, backed by a Spanish army. Machiavelli lost his position, was arrested, tortured and exiled to the family farmhouse in Sant'Andrea, in Pecucina, 15 kilometers from the city he had served for 14 years. There, alone, without power, without money, and without prospects, at 43 years old, he wrote the texts that made him immortal: The Prince, the Discourses on Livy, the Art of War, the Florentine Histories. Over the next 75 minutes, you will follow the life of the man behind these texts. You will understand what formed him, what destroyed him, what he actually said, and why the version that has reached us is a deliberate distortion that serves precisely the interests of those who have the most to lose from what he really wrote. Because the story of Machiavelli is not the story of a man who loved power. It is the story of a man who loved it enough to tell the truth about it, and who paid for that with the only years he had left. But before entering his life, I need to leave you with a question. The Prince was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the very man whose return to power had destroyed Machiavelli's career and sent him to the torture chamber. Why? Was there genuine humility in this dedication? A desperate political calculation from a man who simply wanted his job back? Or something more disturbing, the conviction that the book would be completely misunderstood by whoever received it, and that the true intended reader was someone else entirely? There is a third possibility that historians rarely discuss openly: that Machiavelli knew exactly what he was doing, and that the dedication was the final layer of protection from a man who had learned, over 14 years in power, that survival depends on never fully revealing what you know. The answer changes everything. Imagine growing up in Florence in the last quarter of the 15th century. The first thing you learn about the city is not its beauty, though beauty is everywhere, in the frescoes covering the walls of churches, in the domes dominating the skyline, in the facades of the palaces that the great bankers built to show that wealth and culture were not opposites, but natural allies. The first thing you learn is the smell. Florence, in the 15th century, smells of wool. The city had built its fortune on the processing and trading of textiles, the workshops where fibers were beaten, dyed and spun, saturated the Oltrarno neighborhoods with an odor that blended with the smell of the Arno River. In the warm months, and with the smoke of heating fires in the cold ones, it was the smell of money, the smell of power that needed no announcement because it was everywhere. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in this city on the 3rd of May, 1469. His father, Bernardo di Niccolò Machiavelli, was a jurist, not a lawyer in the modern sense of someone with a lucrative clientele, but a man of classical education who ran a modest practice and who kept at home what for the era was a considerable library. Bernardo's account books have survived in the Florentine archives and reveal a man of limited means but clear priorities. There are entries documenting the purchase of books at times when the family had outstanding debts. This choice shaped his son in a way that no amount of wealth could have replaced. Bernardo's library contained Livy, Cicero, the Roman historians and philosophers who would become the intellectual foundation of everything Machiavelli would write. These were not readings for escapism, they were readings for formation, grounded in the conviction that understanding how Rome had worked was to understand how power worked in any age. Young Niccolò grew up with this conviction so deeply embedded that, decades later, when he would write The Prince and the Discourses, the constant interlocutor would always be Rome, not as nostalgia, but as a laboratory. The Florence in which Machiavelli grew up was governed by the Medici with a subtlety that was itself a political lesson. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, as posterity called him, was not king, nor duke, nor prince with any official title. He was, formally, a citizen among citizens, the first of a republic that maintained all the forms of collective government. In practice, he controlled appointments, alliances, money, and violence with an efficiency that made any opposition not merely dangerous, but impossible to organize. Machiavelli was 9 years old when the Pazzi conspiracy, in April of 1478, attempted to destroy the Medici in a single bloody afternoon. The Pazzi banking rivals of the Medici, backed by Pope Sixtus IV, attacked Lorenzo and his brother, Giuliano, during Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Giuliano was killed, stabbed 19 times beside the altar. Lorenzo escaped wounded, taking refuge in the sacristy while the city erupted. What followed was a lesson Machiavelli never forgot. Lorenzo did not respond with clemency or with negotiation. He responded with speed and with a calculated cruelty that matched that of the conspirators themselves. The bodies of the Pazzi were hung from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Archbishop of Florence, one of the conspirators, was hanged from an open window, still wearing his ecclesiastical vestments, convulsively biting the shoulder of the man suspended beside him. The Pope was so shocked by the execution of the Archbishop that he excommunicated Lorenzo and declared war on Florence. Lorenzo navigated the crisis with a combination of military force, personal diplomacy, and public theatre that consolidated his power rather than weakening it. Young Niccolò observed all of this, not directly, since he was 9 years old, but through conversations at home, through the stories circulating about the city, through the remarks adults made about what had happened and what it meant. What it meant was simple and brutal. Power that does not defend itself is lost. Cruelty used at the right moment, decisively and without hesitation, is a form of stability. The kindness that allows enemies to survive is a form of political suicide. Lorenzo died in 1492. His son Piero inherited the power but not the talent, and when Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, Piero negotiated a capitulation so humiliating that the Florentines expelled him from the city before the French even arrived. Machiavelli was 25 years old and was watching his second great lesson about power. A prince who does not know when to yield and when to hold firm, who confuses prudence with cowardice and firmness with stubbornness, loses everything. Not gradually, with dignity, all at once, with humiliation. Piero de' Medici died in exile. The Medici name became, for a few years, a curse in Florence. And in a modest apartment in the city, a young man named Niccolò was beginning to understand that there were patterns in what he saw, that power was not arbitrary, that it had a logic that could be described, and that describing that logic with precision was perhaps the most useful thing anyone could do. For years remained before he would have the opportunity to test that conviction. There was a man in Florence who believed he had seen God. Not metaphorically, not in the vague sense in which believers describe moments of spiritual illumination. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar from Ferrara, believed he had received direct visions from the divine, specific messages about what was coming, about what Florence had done wrong, and about what it needed to do to escape the approaching destruction. In 1494, with the French invasion proving that he had correctly prophesied the coming of a scourge from the north, the entire city seemed to believe along with him. Machiavelli was 25 years old when Savonarola came to power. He was not a believer. The texts he left behind suggests a man of superficial religious convictions who saw the church primarily as a political institution, but he was an observer. And what he observed during the 4 years of Savonarola's dominion over Florence shaped some of the most enduring convictions of his intellectual life. The first conviction was about the nature of charisma. Savonarola had no army, he had no money, he had none of the family and banking connections that had sustained Medici power for decades. What he had was a voice of such rhetorical power and precision that contemporaries describe it with a unanimity that transcends both admiration and hostility. When Savonarola preached in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, crowds filled the nave and spilled out into the square outside. Men and women of all social classes described the experience of hearing him as a physical transformation, a warmth rising through the body, a certainty settling where doubt had been before. It was power, a different kind of power from that of the Medici, built not on money and alliances, but on the capacity to make people feel something they wanted to feel. Florence transformed itself within months. The bonfires of the Vanities, the Follow del Vanita, were the most visible symbol of this transformation. In 1497 and 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria, mirrors, cosmetics, luxury clothing, playing cards, books of poetry deemed lascivious, paintings of profane subjects, and musical instruments associated with worldly entertainment were publicly burned. The crowds that attended were not merely spectators, they were participants, bringing their own objects to throw into the flames, competing in demonstrating a renunciation of the world that Savonarola had convinced them was necessary. Machiavelli observed all of this not with a moral eye but an analytical one. What he saw was not a people who had found virtue. It was a people who had found a mirror in which they saw themselves as they wished to be seen, pure, committed, chosen by God for a special mission. Savonarola had not created this need. He had recognized that it existed and had built upon it with the precision of an architect who knows exactly what materials he has available. This observation would become one of the central arguments of the prince. Men are not moved primarily by reason. They are moved by what they feel, by fear, by pride, by the need to believe that their lives carry a meaning that transcends the everyday. A ruler who understands this can do things with a population that no military force can achieve. A ruler who ignores it can hold all the formal power in the world and still keep losing. But then Machiavelli observed what happened when charisma ran dry. Savonarola's problem was structural, and it was fatal. He had built his power on a promise that time would inevitably make false. He had said that Florence would be saved if it repented. Florence repented and continued to suffer. The French invasion had passed, but the economic problems, the political tensions, and the instability that accompany any transition of power had not disappeared with the bonfires of the Vanities. When reality failed to confirm the prophecy, believers did not immediately question the prophet. They questioned him slowly, with the reluctance of those who do not want to accept they were deceived. But doubt, once planted, did not stop growing. In 1497, Pope Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola. The excommunication was politically motivated. Alexander was not a pope of deep religious conviction, but it produced an effect the friar had not anticipated. The city that had followed Savonarola, because it believed he spoke for God, suddenly confronted the possibility that he was speaking against the church. And for many Florentines, the distinction between God and the institutional church was too abstract to sustain under pressure. Popular support began to fragment. In April of 1498, a group of citizens, the Piagnoni Savonarola's followers, against the Arrabbiati, his opponents, clashed openly in the streets of Florence. The city government, which had tolerated Savonarola as long as his power served as a useful instrument of legitimacy, saw in the crisis the opportunity to free itself from a dependency that had begun to weigh heavily. Savonarola was arrested, tortured and burned in the Piazza della Signoria in May of 1498, in exactly the same spot where he had presided over the bonfires of the Vanities. Machiavelli witnessed this, or heard from those who had, and understood what had happened. And he wrote, years later, in one of the most quoted lines from The Prince, the lesson he drew from all of it: armed prophets have always conquered, and the unarmed have come to grief. Savonarola had the charisma, he had the vision, he had the support of an entire population. He did not have the army, and without the army, everything else was just words. There is a paradox at the heart of Machiavelli's career that his biographers rarely analyze with the attention it deserves. The man who would come to be known as the theorist of absolute power, the advisor to princes, the apologist for calculated cruelty, spent the best years of his life in the service of a republic. Not as a critic, not as a distant observer, but as a dedicated civil servant who genuinely believed that republican government was the highest form of political organization that human beings had ever invented. This conviction was not abstract. It was built on the direct experience of working within a system where decisions were made through debate, where power circulated among citizens rather than concentrating in a single hand, and where the law, imperfect, slow, frequently and frustratingly inadequate, was still a barrier between arbitrariness and order. In June of 1498, just a few weeks after the execution of Savonarola, Machiavelli was appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. The appointment was swift and revealed something about how he was perceived by those who made the decision. Not as a prominent figure, not as a representative of a family or faction with its own power, but as someone competent, with no compromising track record, and sufficiently discreet to manage sensitive matters without creating additional political problems. It was exactly the kind of appointment governments make when they want efficiency without drama. Machiavelli delivered efficiency, and observed everything he could observe. The position included responsibility for diplomatic correspondence, coordination with Florentine military commissioners, and the preparation of reports for the Republic's governing councils. In practice, this meant traveling missions to neighboring courts and states to negotiate, gather intelligence, and report back to the government what he had seen and heard. The first significant mission was to Caterina Sforza in 1499. Caterina was the ruler of Forik and Imola, two territories in central Italy that Florence wanted to keep out of the orbit of its rivals. She was also one of the most extraordinary women of her time, illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, widow of 3 husbands, mother of several children, and a military commander of a competence that the men who faced her described with a mixture of admiration and terror. Machiavelli's mission was to negotiate the renewal of a condotta contract, an agreement by which Caterina's troops would be available for Florentine service in exchange for payment. What he found was his first direct lesson in the difference between the language of power and actual power. Caterina received him. She listened to him. She agreed with practically everything he said. And then she signed nothing, committed to nothing, and conceded nothing of substance, using the form of negotiation to buy time while exploring more advantageous options elsewhere. Machiavelli returned to Florence without the agreement and with a report that documented with precision what had happened. Not just the outcome, but the method. It was the first time he had recorded, in a systematic way, the difference between what rulers say and what they do. It would not be the last. The most urgent problem of his early years in the position was Pisa. The port city had exploited the French invasion of 1494 to declare independence from Florence, and the Republic had spent years trying to reclaim it without success. The central problem was military. Florence depended on mercenaries for its armies, and mercenaries were an instrument of a structural unreliability that Machiavelli documented with growing frustration in his reports. Mercenaries did not want to die. This statement seems obvious but had practical consequences that destroyed entire military campaigns. A mercenary captain who lost too many men found himself without a business. The surviving soldiers would not renew contracts with leaders who exposed them to real risk. So mercenary armies tended to maneuver, to lay siege, to negotiate, to do everything except what an army exists to do when the decisive moment arrived. Pisa resisted for years because the Florentine armies did not want to take it badly enough. This observation became the central obsession of Machiavelli's first decade of service, the conviction that a state, without soldiers of its own, citizens who fight for their city because it is their city, has no real defense. It has an illusion of defense that collapses at exactly the moment it is most needed. The solution he began to formulate are Florentine citizens. Militia was simultaneously obvious in theory and extraordinarily difficult in practice. It required convincing rulers who preferred mercenaries precisely because mercenaries did not vote, had no political opinions, and could be dismissed when the war was over. Armed citizens were something else entirely. They were power. And power, as Machiavelli had learned from Lorenzo de' Medici, and from Savonarola, and from Caterina Sforza, was the one thing those who had at least liked to Today, when we talk about leadership, we talk about vision, about empathy, about authentic communication, about building organizational cultures where people feel valued and safe. Cesare Borgia would have found this incomprehensible. Not because he was stupid, he was probably the most intelligent man Machiavelli ever knew personally, and Machiavelli knew personally some of the most intelligent men of his time. But because he operated from a different premise about human nature and about what power truly demanded of those who exercised it. The premise was simple. Men obey out of fear or out of love, but love is unstable and fear is reliable, provided the fear is intense enough to paralyze resistance, but not so extreme that it produces despair. Because the desperate man has nothing to lose and therefore cannot be controlled. Machiavelli arrived at Cesare Borgia's court in October of 1502, sent by the Florentine government to assess the Duke of Valentinois's intentions toward the territories of Tuscany. The mission was delicate because the situation was unstable in a way that the usual diplomatic categories could not adequately describe. Cesare had spent the previous 3 years building a state in central Italy, the Romagna, from scratch, using a combination of military force, strategic betrayal, and a theatricality of power that Machiavelli immediately recognized as deliberate and calculated. His father, Pope Alexander VI, provided the ecclesiastical legitimacy and the financing. Cesare provided the execution. What Machiavelli found in Imola, and then in Cesena, was not a barbaric warlord. It was something more unsettling, a man who had thought systematically about power, with the same analytical depth that Machiavelli had developed as an observer, but who had arrived at his conclusions as a practitioner and was testing them in real time on real populations. The first episode that Machiavelli documented with particular attention was the matter of Ramiro de Orco. Cesare had appointed Ramiro de Orco as governor of the Romagna, with explicit instructions to pacify the region, which was violent, fragmented, and accustomed to an autonomy that made any central authority difficult to impose. Ramiro carried out the instructions with a brutality that was effective precisely because it made no exceptions. Within 2 years, the Romagna was pacified, the roads were safe, the law functioned, and the population hated Ramiro with an intensity that threatened to become a political problem for Cesare. What Cesare did next was the moment that Machiavelli described in The Prince with an admiration that shocked readers of every subsequent era. One December morning in 1502, the inhabitants of Cesena woke to find Ramiro de Orco in the central square of the city, split in two, with a bloody knife and a wooden block beside the body. Cesare had ordered the execution of his own governor, not because Ramiro had failed, because he had succeeded too well in the wrong way. He had done the dirty work that needed doing, and had then become the repository of the hatred that work inevitably generated. The public and spectacular execution transferred that hatred from the prince to the dead minister, leaving Cesare as the man who had punished excessive cruelty in the name of justice. It was theatre, and it was brilliant. Machiavelli wrote to the Florentine government, describing the event with a precision that left no doubt about what he thought. That Cesare had done something that deserved to be studied, not because it was morally admirable, but because it revealed an understanding of the workings of power that most rulers did not possess. The second episode was the ambush at Senigallia in December of that same year. Caesar's mercenary captains, the Vitelli, the Orsini, the Boglioni, had conspired against him at a meeting in Magione in October of 1502. Cesare learned of the conspiracy, feigned reconciliation, and invited the conspirators to a meeting at Senigallia to jointly celebrate the retaking of the city. The conspirators went because Caesar had carefully built, over a period of weeks, the illusion that the reconciliation was genuine, gestures of goodwill, minor concessions, words calculated to produce the feeling of safety that made the journey to Senigallia seem plausible. When they arrived, they were arrested. 2 were strangled that same night. The others died in the days that followed. Machiavelli was in Senigallia when this happened. He did not witness the killings. He was kept at a distance, as was proper for a diplomatic representative in a situation that was not diplomatically recognizable. But he saw the prisoners. He saw Caesar's face before and after. And he wrote to the Florentine government one of the most extraordinary letters in his entire correspondence, not of horror, not of moral approval, but of cold analysis from a man who was seeing for the first time in his life power operating exactly in the way he had suspected it did, but had never directly confirmed. Cesare Borgia was not a moral model. He was a laboratory, and Machiavelli was the scientist taking notes. Chapter I watched a man build a state from nothing in 3 years. I watched the same man lose everything in 3 weeks. And the difference between the 2 moments was not his intelligence, nor his courage, nor his methods. It was a fever that his father caught on an August night. There is no record that Machiavelli wrote those exact words, but there are records of what he observed between August and October of 1503. And what he observed in that period is sufficiently documented for these words to be, if not literally his, at least true about what he lived through. Pope Alexander VI died in August of 1503. The official cause was fever, most likely malaria, which swept through Rome during the warm months and made no distinction between popes and beggars. Alexander was 72 years old and had governed the church with an energy and an absence of scruples that his contemporaries recognized as exceptional, even in a context where the moral standards of the papacy were not high. What his death meant for Cesare was catastrophic in a way that any clear-eyed analysis of the situation made immediately apparent. The Borgia project had been built on two pillars. The first was Caesar's military force, real, feared, effective. The second was Alexander's papal authority, which provided the legal legitimacy for the territorial conquests, the financing through church resources, and the diplomatic protection that made European powers cautious about intervening directly against a pope's son. With Alexander dead, the second pillar vanished. Cesare was ill when his father died, the same fever, most likely, that had killed Alexander. Sources describe a man who hovered between life and death for weeks, unable to act, unable to consolidate the position he had built, reduced to managing the crisis from a sickbed, while the enemies he had defeated and humiliated over 3 years returned to reclaim what had been theirs. Machiavelli followed all of this closely from Tuscany, through correspondence, through informants, with the attention of someone who had invested years studying this man, and was now watching the experiment reach a conclusion that theory had not entirely predicted. The lesson he drew was not that Cesare had failed because he was cruel or immoral. The lesson was about fortune. Fortune, not in the modern sense of luck, but in the sense that the Romans gave the word, the force of external circumstances that no human capacity can completely control. Machiavelli had learned, through Lorenzo de' Medici and through Savonarola, that power required method. Through Cesare he was learning now that the most perfect method could be destroyed by a fever on an August night. This insight would become one of the central axes of the prince, the distinction between virtù and fortuna, between what the prince can control and what he cannot, and the question of how to act intelligently in a world where half of everything that happens lies beyond the reach of any human decision. The election of Pope Julius II in November of 1503 definitively closed the Borgia chapter. Julius was Caesar's personal enemy, one of the men that Alexander had persecuted and who had waited patiently for the opportunity to reverse what the Borgias had built. With Julius on the throne of St. Peter, Cesare lost the last resources sustaining him. He was arrested, escaped, went into exile in Navarre where his wife's family held power, and died in 1507 in a minor skirmish, without the state he had built, without the name that had once been feared, forgotten with the speed that is the fate of all those who depend solely on force to maintain themselves. Machiavelli recorded the fall of Cesare with the same analytical attentiveness with which he had recorded the rise. And he concluded something that popular versions of the prince rarely capture. Cesare had done almost everything correctly. He had built a state with an efficiency that governance manuals rarely achieve. He had managed internal enemies with surgical precision. He had understood power better than any ruler Machiavelli had observed. And he had committed one single fatal error. He had built everything on a single dependency. His father, without building in parallel a foundation that would survive the loss of that dependency. It was an error that any honest analysis of the situation made visible. It was also an error that most of the rulers Machiavelli had observed, repeated in infinite variations, excessive reliance on a single source of power, a single alliance, a single instrument that, when it failed, brought everything else down with it. Machiavelli's missions, to the imperial court, of Maximilian I in 1507 confirmed and expanded this observation. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was the opposite of Cesare in almost every relevant respect, indecisive where Cesare was resolute, dependent on consensus where Cesare was unilateral, incapable of holding a position long enough for it to produce results. Machiavelli spent months observing Maximilian with the patience of a naturalist studying a rare specimen, and wrote a report, The Portrait of German Affairs, that is itself an exercise in political analysis of a clarity that directly anticipates the prince. The conclusion of the report was merciless. A ruler who does not know what he wants, who shifts position under pressure, and who delegates difficult decisions, ends up governing nothing. No matter how many resources he has, no matter how many titles he displays, no matter how much historical legitimacy his position carries, power is not a title, it is an exercise, and an exercise that is interrupted is a power that is lost. There is a deep irony at the heart of the most ambitious project of Machiavelli's career as a public servant, the man that posterity knows as the theorist of singular princely power, of concentrated authority, of force without sentimentalism, spent the best years of his life trying to convince a republic to arm its own citizens. Not because he was naive about what armed citizens could do to a government that displeased them. Machiavelli was naive about nothing. But because he had arrived, through years of direct observation, at a conclusion he considered irrefutable. A state without soldiers of its own has no real independence. It has the illusion of independence, maintained as long as the mercenaries are paid, as long as the alliances hold, as long as no real crisis tests the difference between the appearance of strength and effective strength. Pisa had proven this through a decade of repeated humiliations. The problem was not that Florentine armies were poorly commanded. There were capable generals in the Republic's service. The problem was that the mercenary soldiers those generals commanded had no reason to risk their lives for Florence. They had every reason to show up, to maneuver, to appear threatening enough to justify the payments, but not to die on a rampart for a city that was not their own. The solution Machiavelli presented to the Florentine government in 1504 was simultaneously obvious and politically explosive. Recruit, train and organize a militia of Tuscan peasants, men from the villages and fields around Florence, who would fight for a territory that was literally their own, who knew the land they were defending, who had family and property at stake, not mercenaries who could leave, citizens who had nowhere to go. The resistance within the government was immediate and predictable. Armed citizens voted. Armed citizens had opinions. Armed citizens who had learned to fight in formation and to obey commanders were, from the perspective of any sensible ruler, an instrument of external defense that was simultaneously a risk of internal instability. The history of Rome, which Machiavelli cited with a frequency his colleagues found excessive, was full of militias that had eventually turned their weapons against those who had created them. Machiavelli counter-argued with a patience that the documents of the period reveal as increasingly strained. He maintained that the risk of armed citizens was real but manageable, that a republic which did not trust its citizens enough to arm them did not deserve the loyalty it expected from them, that the alternative, mercenaries, was a guarantee of structural weakness that no amount of money could compensate for, that Rome had been great precisely because Romans had fought for their own cities, and that Rome's decline had begun exactly when citizen armies were replaced by professionals who fought for wages. In 1506, after 2 years of bureaucratic debate, the Florentine government authorized the experiment. Machiavelli went personally into the field to recruit. He traveled through the villages of Tuscany, spoke with peasants, assessed men, organized the first training sessions with an energy that his reports describe as genuinely enthusiastic, rare in a civil servant who had learned to write with the calculated distance of someone who does not want to overcommit to anything. This time, he was committed. The militia grew over 5 years. In 1509, it was used for the first time in real operations during the final siege of Pisa, and contributed to the city's surrender after 15 years of resistance. For Machiavelli, who had spent years arguing that motivated citizens beat unmotivated mercenaries, it was the empirical confirmation of a thesis that had cost years of bureaucratic struggle to impose. It was also the highest point of his career. What followed was the destruction of everything he had built, not gradually, but with the brutal speed that Machiavelli had observed in Cesare Borgia and was now experiencing in his own flesh. In August of 1512, a Spanish army in the service of Pope Julius II and the exiled Medici advanced on Tuscany. The Florentine government sent the militia to defend Prato, a city a few kilometers from Florence. The first defensive line, protecting access to the capital. The confrontation lasted less than an afternoon. The Spanish soldiers were professionals hardened in campaigns through a decade of Italian wars. The Florentine militia were peasants with a few years of intermittent training. The gap in experience and combat discipline was too great for any ideological motivation to bridge. Prato was sacked. Historical accounts describe the massacre with a specificity that Machiavelli knew well. He had documented similar massacres in other contexts with the clinical precision of a civil servant recording what he had witnessed. This time it was different. This time it was his project lying on the ground. The Florentine government surrendered within days. The Medici returned. Machiavelli was dismissed, arrested, tortured, and sent into exile. The Republican dream had lasted 14 years. It ended on an August afternoon in Prato, to the sound of walls giving way. In December of 1513, tortured and exiled, Machiavelli wrote to his friend Francesco Vittori, a letter that historians cite as one of the most extraordinary documents in Italian literature. He described his day at the farmhouse, in the morning agricultural work, in the afternoon the local tavern, card games with the miller and the butcher, and at night, he would return home and change his clothes. I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for. He was describing the moment he would sit down with his books of Roman history and begin writing the Prince. But the letter contains a line that textbooks rarely quote. "Whoever reads my books cannot help but wish I would remain in misery." What did he mean? In July of 1513, Machiavelli began writing the most misunderstood book in the history of Western political thought. The conditions were the opposite of what anyone would choose for serious intellectual work. The farmhouse at Sant'Andrea in Pecussina was functional but modest. A country house without the library he had kept in Florence, without the colleagues with whom he had debated ideas for 14 years, without the access to diplomatic sources and archives that his position had provided. The smell was of damp earth and animals, not of candle wax and parchment from the offices of the Signoria. Machiavelli was 44 years old, with pain in his wrists from the ropes of the strappado that he had not entirely forgotten, and with a clarity about what he wanted to write that adversity had distilled rather than destroyed. The book he wrote between July and December of 1513 was not what readers of every subsequent era believed it to be. It was not a manual for tyranny. It was not a celebration of cruelty. It was not the handbook of the unscrupulous prince that his detractors described for 500 years. It was an analysis. The central argument of the prince is stated with a clarity that its interpreters have systematically refused to take at face value. There is an irreducible difference between how men live and how they ought to live, and a ruler who acts according to how things should be rather than how they are learns his own ruin faster than his own salvation. This statement is not a moral recommendation. It is an empirical observation. Machiavelli had spent 14 years watching rulers who acted according to how they believed they should act, with clemency when clemency was expected, with generosity when generosity was politically appropriate, with the language of virtue even when their acts were something else entirely. And he had observed that this gap between appearance and reality did not make rulers more virtuous. It made them less effective and equally cruel, because the cruelty that goes unacknowledged does not disappear. It merely becomes more diffuse, less controlled, more damaging to all those in its path. The central distinction in the book is between virtue and fortuna. Virtue is not virtue in the moral sense. It is capability, the combination of intelligence, strength, determination and adaptability that allows a ruler to respond to circumstances effectively. Fortuna is the force of external circumstances, what happens independently of any human decision. The river that overflows, the fever that kills the father, the Spanish army that arrives with a force the citizens' militia cannot withstand. Machiavelli argues that fortune controls roughly half of everything that happens, and that the other half is available to whoever has sufficient virtue to seize it. The question of cruelty, the one that shocked readers of every era, is addressed in the book with a precision that summaries rarely capture. Machiavelli does not recommend cruelty for its own sake. He recommends that cruelty, when necessary, be carried out all at once, completely and swiftly, rather than administered in small doses over time. The cruelty concentrated at the beginning of a principate, which removes enemies and establishes order, is in total less cruel than the kindness that allows problems to accumulate until they demand a far greater violence to be resolved. It is a utilitarian argument, not a sadistic one. And it is an argument that anyone who has observed how human organizations actually function, not how they should function, but how they do, will recognize with an uncomfortable familiarity. The dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici has been interpreted as calculated humility, as desperate political calculation, as veiled irony, the simplest interpretation that Machiavelli genuinely wanted to recover a position in the Florentine government, and believed that demonstrating his usefulness was the way to accomplish it, is probably the closest to the truth, though it does not exhaust it. What is certain is that Lorenzo did not read the book carefully. Or he read it and did not understand. Or he understood and did not want to understand. The prince circulated in manuscript form during the 16 remaining years of Machiavelli's life, read by a few, debated in restricted circles, never acknowledged by its official recipient as the instrument of analysis it was. Machiavelli never recovered his position. But he wrote, in that same letter to Vettori, in which he described his nights with the ancient men, a sentence about the prince that historians cite as the key to understanding what he was really doing. He said he had put into that small book everything he knew about power, everything he had learned in 14 years of direct service and observation. And he said he hoped it would be useful, not to Lorenzo de' Medici, to whoever read it with sufficient attention to understand what it was truly saying. There is a book that explains The Prince better than any academic commentary ever written. It is a book by Machiavelli himself. It was written in parallel with The Prince. It is 3 times as long, and most people who hold a formed opinion of Machiavelli have never read it. It is called The Discourses on the First Decade of Titus Livy. The existence of the discourses creates a problem for the simplified version of Machiavelli that circulates in popular culture: the advisor to tyrants, the theorist of limitless cruelty, the man who taught princes to oppress with efficiency. Because the discourses are not a handbook for princes. They are a systematic and passionate argument in favor of republican government as the highest form of political organization that human beings had yet invented. The Machiavelli of the discourses is not the cold cynicism of the prince. He is a man who believes profoundly that political liberty is the most valuable good a community can possess, and who is willing to analyze with brutal rigor what is required to build it, maintain it, and recover it when lost. The central thesis of the discourses is developed from the history of Rome, specifically from the first centuries of the Republic, which Livy had narrated with a richness of detail that Machiavelli had read and reread since adolescence in his father's library. Rome was the laboratory. The argument was that Rome's greatness had not been the product of luck or of the individual virtue of its leaders, but of institutions, of a system that distributed power, channeled internal conflicts productively, and created mechanisms for correction when individual leaders failed. This idea that institutions matter more than individuals, that a well-designed system survives mediocre leaders while a poorly designed system is not saved by exceptional ones, is one of the most enduring contributions to Western political thought. And it is in the discourses, not in the prince. The tension between the 2 books is real, but it is not a contradiction. It is an analysis of 2 different problems that require different answers. The prince answers the question, what should a ruler do when the republic has already collapsed, when institutions are not functioning, when the state is in crisis in a way that collective government cannot resolve with the speed the situation demands? The answer is a prince with sufficient vertige to act decisively, who concentrates the power necessary to stabilize the situation and who, ideally, creates the conditions for republican institutions to eventually be restored. The discourses answer the question, how does one build and maintain a republic that lasts? The answer is long, detailed and fascinating, and includes the observation that internal conflicts, which rulers of every era tend to suppress as signs of weakness, are in reality signs of political health. A republic in which different interests can express themselves and compete openly is more stable than one in which conflict is suppressed and accumulates pressure until it explodes uncontrollably. This idea that managed conflict is preferable to forced harmony was radically contrary to the political consensus of its time, and it remains uncomfortable for many rulers of our own. The discourses were written for the Orti or Ocelleri, the gardens of the Rucellai family in Florence, where a group of young intellectuals gathered to discuss history, politics, and philosophy with a seriousness that the city's cultural climate still permitted despite Medici dominance. Machiavelli was the oldest and most experienced member of the group, the man who had seen what the others had only read. The discussions in those gardens were the true audience for which the discourses were written. Not Lorenzo de' Medici, not the Pope, not the princes that the prince nominally addressed, but young Florentines who loved the Republic and who needed to understand why it had failed, and what would be required to ensure it did not fail again. There is a passage in the discourses that historians identify as the most personal moment in all of Machiavelli's work, more personal than any letter, more honest than any diplomatic report. Machiavelli writes that a man who has seen his republic destroyed, who served the institutions he loved with everything he had, and who watched them collapse despite everything, has two choices. He can despair, or he can try to understand why they failed, with enough honesty to include his own errors in the analysis, and pass that understanding on to whoever might one day try again. Machiavelli chose the second option. The discourses are that choice in the form of a book. Today, when a public official loses his position for political reasons, there are established paths back: the waiting period, the gradual rehabilitation, the demonstration of usefulness through lateral channels that eventually reconnect the exile with the power structures that excluded him. Machiavelli tried all of these paths. None worked completely. And the reason none worked completely reveals something about the kind of man he was, and about the kind of city Florence had become, again under the Medici. The years between 1513 and 1519 had been ones of productive exile, but real isolation. The discourses, the prints, the art of war, the texts that would define his reputation for the centuries ahead were written, or being written. But they circulated in manuscript, read by restricted circles, without the public recognition that could transform them into political credentials. The first concrete sign that the Medici acknowledged his talent arrived in 1520. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, cousin of Pope Leo X, and a man of considerable culture who governed Florence with an elegance that contrasted with the brutality of the return of 1512, commissioned Machiavelli to write the Florentine histories. It was an official commission, a real payment, a recognition that the former chancellor possessed capabilities that the Florentine state could make use of, even if not in the position he had held, even if not with the responsibility he had carried. Machiavelli accepted with a gratitude that the documents of the period reveal as genuine and calculated simultaneously. Genuine because he needed the money and the recognition. Calculated because he knew that the Florentine histories were an opportunity to demonstrate, through his writing, that his judgment about power was valuable enough to justify a return to something closer to the center. The mission to Carpe in 1521 was less encouraging. Carpe was a minor city in the northern Italian states, exactly the kind of minor diplomatic mission that Machiavelli had managed dozens of times during his years of service, but which he then managed as second chancellor with real responsibility for outcomes. In 1521, he was sent as representative of the Florentine Wool Merchants Guild in a dispute over the organization of Franciscan friars in the region. It was a quiet humiliation for a man who had personally negotiated with Cesare Borgia and with Emperor Maximilian. Machiavelli went all the same, and he wrote from Carpe to his friend Francesco Guicciardini, historian and papal official who was one of the few intellectual interlocutors he had maintained through the years of exile, a letter that is simultaneously hilarious and devastating in its self-awareness. He described his arrival in Carpe with deliberately exaggerated pomp. He had asked the messenger who preceded him to ride on horseback, to create the impression that he was accompanied by a significant delegation. He described his conversations with the friars with the irony of a man who knew exactly the distance between what he was doing and what he had once done. And he ended with a line that Guicciardini quoted back in his reply with the laughter it deserved. "For a long time I have not said what I believe, nor believed what I say, and if I sometimes happen to tell the truth, I hide it among so many lies that it is hard to find." It was the most honest description he ever gave of the condition of the man who wants to return to power and who has learned that power does not welcome those who speak truth directly. The election of Giulio de' Medici as Pope Clement VII in 1523 renewed his hopes. Clement knew Machiavelli, had commissioned the Florentine histories, had demonstrated that he appreciated talent regardless of political history. There was reason to believe that a position closer to the center was possible. It never came. The Florentine histories were presented to Clement in 1525 and received with approval, but without the political consequence Machiavelli had hoped for. The Pope had other concerns. Charles V and Francis I were at war for the hegemony of Italy, and the papacy was trying to navigate between the two powers with a skill that Machiavelli, in his texts from this period, considered insufficient for the scale of the threat. He was right. In May of 1527, the army of Charles V, a conglomerate of German Landsknechts, Spanish soldiers and Italian mercenaries who had not been paid for months, sacked Rome for days with a violence that shocked all of Europe. Clement VII took refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo and watched the sacking of the city he governed through the windows of a fortress he had been unable to defend. The sack of Rome destroyed the papacy as an effective political power in a way that no excommunication or council had managed. In Florence, the news of the papal collapse was the signal that the Medici's opponents had been waiting for. The family was expelled for the third time. The Republic was restored. Machiavelli, who had served the previous Republic for 14 years, who had been tortured when it collapsed, who had spent 15 years writing about why republics fail and how they might be better built, put himself forward for a position in the new Republic. He was rejected. The new Republic did not trust the man who had tried to move closer to the Medici during his years of exile. The Republicans who had resisted Medici dominance saw in Machiavelli not an ally but a collaborationist, someone who had written the Florentine histories on a Medici commission, who had frequented the Ruscelli Gardens, where the Medici permitted intellectual discussion as a controlled release valve. The accusation was unjust. But politics is rarely just. Machiavelli fell ill in June of 1527, just a few weeks after the rejection. He died on the 21st of June, at 58 years old, without having recovered any public position, without having seen the prints published, without having received the recognition that the texts he had written at the farmhouse of Sant'Andrea in Pecucina deserved. The final irony of his life was this. The man who had understood power better than any other thinker of his time, who had documented with surgical precision how rulers rise and fall, how republics are built and destroyed, how fortune destroys even the most capable, died in exactly the manner he had described as the inevitable fate of those who depend on fortune without sufficient virtue to bend it. Not for lack of intelligence, for lack of luck, and for the final cruelty of a republic he had so eagerly awaited, which, when it arrived, did not want him. Machiavelli died in June of 1527, without knowing what his name would become. The Prince was published posthumously in 1532, by a Roman publisher that recognized the commercial value of the text without fully understanding what it was publishing. The first edition sold out. Reprints multiplied across all of Europe. And then began the process of systematic distortion that transformed Niccolò Machiavelli into Machiavellian. In 1559, Pope Paul IV placed all of his texts on the Index of Forbidden Books. The official reason was the immorality of the content. The real reason was simpler. The prince described with devastating precision how ecclesiastical power actually functioned in practice, using the same instruments of fear, manipulation, and calculated violence as any other secular power. A church that had just survived the Protestant Reformation did not need an anatomical manual of its own workings. The prohibition had the opposite effect from the one intended. In England, anything forbidden by the Pope had automatic appeal. The prince became required reading in intellectual circles, but read through a filter of Protestant propaganda that transformed it into a symbol of everything corrupt in Italian Catholicism. In the Elizabethan plays of Marlowe and Shakespeare, the character of the Machiavel was the archetypal villain, intelligent, without scruples, willing to do anything. An extraordinarily useful caricature as an instrument of propaganda. The Protestant rulers who attacked Machiavelli in public speeches read him in their private offices. The Catholic rulers who had banned him applied his principles in the courts they governed. Frederick II of Prussia wrote in 1740 the Anti-Machiavel, a systematic refutation of the prince in the name of virtue and the welfare of the people. The text was published to great success. That same year, Frederick invaded Silesia without a declaration of war, violating treaties he had just signed, and triggered a war that lasted 8 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Anti-Machiavel continued to be published. The invasion of Silesia was one of the most brilliant strategic maneuvers of the 18th century. Napoleon carried an annotated copy of The Prince on campaign. Mussolini wrote his university thesis on Machiavelli. The Discourses, the Republican book, the most sophisticated argument about how free societies are built, were far less read, far less cited. This was no accident. The Prince was useful to those who held power. The Discourses were useful to those who did not. The history of how Machiavelli was received is the most perfect confirmation of his central thesis. The powerful used what was useful to them and suppressed what was inconvenient, exactly as Machiavelli had said they would. There is a temptation, upon reaching the end of this life, to resolve it into a single sentence: the man who loved the Republic and wrote a handbook for princes, the loyal civil servant who was tortured for his loyalty, the clearest thinker about power who died without power. I will resist that temptation. What Machiavelli did was not invent the cruelty of power. It was to describe it. This distinction is everything, and it is the distinction that his detractors have systematically refused to accept, because accepting the distinction forced an uncomfortable consequence, that the problem was not Machiavelli, but the power he had described. Why would a man who believed deeply in republican government also write a book that admiringly describes the techniques of Cesare Borgia? The answer is in the Discourses. A doctor who wants to cure a disease must understand how it works, with precision, without sentimentalism. Refusing to understand it out of horror at what it does to the body is not virtue. It is intellectual cowardice, dressed up as morality. The Prince is the diagnosis. The Discourses are the treatment. One without the other is incomplete. This conviction cost him everything: the position, the years, the reputation. His name was transformed into an adjective of infamy by precisely those who made the most use of what he had described. It is difficult to think of a crueler fate for a man who had dedicated his entire life to intellectual honesty. Machiavelli wrote, in one of the last letters he left behind, that he had tried to be useful to others with the talent he possessed. That the talent was understanding power, and that he had tried to pass that understanding on in the most honest way he could. He did not apologize for it. He never apologized for it. The rulers who read him and attacked him were right to attack him, not because Machiavelli was dangerous to citizens, but because he was dangerous to them. A text that describes with precision how power maintains itself through fear strips power of its primary defense. The illusion that what it does is different from how it appears. Machiavelli removed that illusion with the detachment of a surgeon. And the world, which preferred the illusion to the diagnosis, did what it always does with those who remove it. It attacked the surgeon, called him a monster, and went right on doing exactly what he had described. If you walk away with a single sentence of Machiavelli's in your head, look it up in the original text before you quote it. Context changes everything. The line about it being better to be feared than loved has a second part that almost never appears in citations. Machiavelli writes that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. But he adds something essential. The prince must, above all else, avoid being hated. The fear that produces hatred destroys a ruler faster than any external enemy. It is a far more complex argument, and a far more useful one, than the fragment that usually circulates, as is almost everything in Machiavelli. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to follow the next stories, and leave a comment with the aspect of Machiavelli that surprised you most, or the decision you think was the greatest mistake of his life. The next video is coming soon. The story continues.